What if the person trying to intimidate you only has as much power as the amount of fear you are willing to carry for them? Let's talk about something that has happened to every single person watching this. You walk into a room, a meeting, a conversation, a confrontation, and there is someone there who has made it their business to make you feel small. Maybe they do it loudly. Maybe they do it with a look. Maybe they do it with the particular kind of silence that is specifically designed to make you wonder what you did wrong. And something happens inside you that you didn't choose and couldn't prevent. Your chest tightens. Your thoughts scatter. The words you had prepared dissolve somewhere between your brain and your mouth. And suddenly you are not the person you were 5 minutes ago, you are a smaller, less certain, more anxious version of yourself, operating in a reality that someone else has constructed specifically to keep you off balance. This is intimidation. And it is one of the oldest power plays in human history. But here is what nobody tells you about intimidation, and this is the thing that changes everything once you truly understand it. Intimidation has no power of its own. None. Zero. It is entirely, completely, 100% dependent on your participation. The person trying to intimidate you is not actually doing anything to you. They are making an offer. An invitation to a dynamic where they hold the authority and you accept the subordinate position. And every time you feel that chest tightening, every time your thoughts scatter, every time you shrink, you are accepting the invitation. Today, we stop accepting. 7 Stoic lessons. Ancient wisdom. Completely, ruthlessly applicable to the modern world. Let's go. Lesson 1. Understand where their power actually comes from. The Stoics were obsessed with one question above almost all others: what is actually real here? Not what appears to be real. Not what feels real in the heat of a moment. But what is, underneath all the performance and projection and psychological maneuvering, actually, fundamentally, verifiably real. And when you apply that question to intimidation, something remarkable happens. The power collapses. Because when you look at it clearly, when you strip away the loud voice, the dismissive tone, the manufactured authority, the carefully constructed aura of someone who needs you to believe they are bigger than you, what you find underneath is almost always the same thing. A person who is afraid. Not of you specifically, necessarily. But afraid. Of being challenged. Of being exposed. Of losing the position they have worked hard to construct through the management of other people's perceptions rather than the development of genuine substance. Let me tell you about a man named Richard. Richard was a senior manager who had built an entire career on intimidation. He spoke over people in meetings. He used silence as a weapon. He had a particular way of looking at someone who asked a question he didn't like, a slow, measured, contemptuous look that had reduced more than a few talented people to apologizing for their own intelligence. For years, everyone assumed Richard was brilliant. Then the company hired a consultant named Adiz. And Adiz had not received the memo about Richard. She asked him, in a meeting full of people, a direct and reasonable question about a decision he had made. Richard deployed the look. Adiz looked back at him with complete, unhurried calm and waited. The silence stretched. And Richard, for the first time in years, had nothing. Because the look only worked on people who had already accepted that he had power over them. Adiz hadn't accepted that. So the look landed on nothing. Like a hook thrown into an empty lake. Within 6 months, the entire office had quietly recalibrated their understanding of Richard. Not because Adiz had attacked him or exposed him dramatically. But because one person's refusal to participate in the dynamic had made the dynamic visible to everyone watching. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If someone is able to show me that what I think or do is not right, I will happily change." The intimidator cannot show you that. Because their position is not built on being right. It is built on your belief that they are powerful. And belief, unlike stone, can be changed the moment you examine what it is actually resting on. Examine it. What you will find is not a foundation. It is a performance. And performances only run as long as the audience keeps watching with the right kind of eyes. Lesson 2, control the only territory that actually belongs to you. Epictetus opened his entire philosophical handbook, the Enchiridion, with a distinction so simple and so revolutionary that it has been transforming lives for 2,000 years. Some things are in our power. Some things are not. In our power, our judgments, our desires, our values, our responses, our inner life. Not in our power, other people's behavior, other people's opinions, external circumstances, outcomes we cannot determine. This distinction is not just philosophy. In the context of intimidation, it is the most practical tool available to you. Because what intimidation attempts to do, at its most fundamental level, is make you believe that something outside your control is actually a threat to something inside your control. It tries to make you feel that their opinion of you determines your value. That their authority over the room translates into authority over your mind. That their ability to make you uncomfortable means they have power over who you actually are. They don't. They have power over the external conditions of the interaction. They can control the room temperature, metaphorically speaking. They can make the atmosphere uncomfortable. They can position themselves to look dominant and make you look subordinate. But your inner life, your clarity, your values, your sense of self, your assessment of the situation, that territory is yours. And it is the only territory that ultimately matters. A young lawyer named Simone had a senior partner in her firm who specialized in making junior associates feel perpetually inadequate. Every piece of work Simone submitted came back covered in red, not always because it was wrong, but because the partner had understood, early in his career, that people who feel inadequate work harder to prove themselves. It was a management strategy built entirely on manufactured insecurity. For the first year, it worked on Simone. She second-guessed every sentence. She rewrote things that didn't need rewriting. She arrived early and stayed late, not out of genuine ambition but out of the anxiety of someone who has handed the evaluation of their own competence to someone who will never give a passing grade. Then Simone made a decision that changed everything. She separated what the partner thought of her work from what she knew about her work. She began keeping a private record, for herself alone, of every piece of analysis she had produced, every argument she had constructed, every outcome she had achieved. A private, honest, evidence-based record that had nothing to do with his red pen. She stopped needing his assessment to be fair. Because she had stopped relying on his assessment to know what was true. That is the Stoic move. Not fighting for the external territory, the approval, the recognition, the fair treatment. But fortifying the internal territory so thoroughly that the external conditions, however unfair, cannot reach the center. Control what is yours to control. And release, genuinely, completely, without resentment, everything that isn't. Lesson 3, let your stillness do the talking. There is a quality that the most unintimidatable people in history have shared, and it is not aggression. It is not loudness. It is not the ability to out-argue, outmaneuver, or outperform the person trying to intimidate them. It is stillness. A particular kind of stillness that is not passivity. Not absence. Not the blank stillness of someone who has switched off. But the active, inhabited, deeply present stillness of someone who is so grounded in themselves that the turbulence around them simply cannot find purchase. Think about water. When you throw a stone into shallow water, the entire surface erupts. The disturbance is total and visible and dramatic. But throw the same stone into the ocean, into deep, vast, ancient water, and the surface barely registers it. A small ripple. Then nothing. Because the depth absorbs what the shallowness cannot. Depth is what stillness produces. And depth is what makes you unintimidatable. Marcus Aurelius described this quality in himself, or rather, in the version of himself he was constantly working to become, as the ability to remain unmoved by what was outside while remaining fully alive to what was within. Present. Attentive. But not reactive. Never reactive. In practical terms, this means that when someone attempts to intimidate you, the most powerful response available to you is often not a response at all. It is the absence of one. The pause. The steady gaze. The unhurried breath. The willingness to let silence sit in the room without rushing to fill it with the anxious, over-explaining, self-justifying words that tell the intimidator their tactic is working. Your stillness communicates something that words often cannot. It says, I am not afraid of this moment. I am not afraid of you. And I have no intention of performing discomfort for your benefit. That message, delivered not in words but in the quiet, grounded, unshakable language of someone who knows who they are, is the most disarming thing you can offer someone whose entire strategy depends on your destabilization. Be the ocean. Let them throw their stones. And watch the surface return to calm before they have even lowered their arm. Lesson 4, refuse the identity they are offering you. This is the lesson that operates at the deepest level. And it is the one that requires the most awareness to catch in real time. Because intimidation is not just a behavioral tactic. It is an identity offer. Every time someone attempts to intimidate you, they are simultaneously handing you a role to play. The role of the subordinate. The uncertain one. The person whose presence in this room is contingent on the tolerance of someone more powerful. The person who needs to earn the right to speak, to question, to take up space. And the tragic thing, the thing that makes intimidation so effective for so long on so many people, is that most of us accept the role without realizing we've been handed it. We don't consciously decide to become smaller. It just happens. The environment shifts, the dynamic is established, the cues are read, and we find ourselves playing a character we never auditioned for, in a story someone else wrote, with an ending that serves everyone except us. The Stoics had a concept they returned to constantly, the idea of the hegemonikon. The ruling faculty. The governing part of the self that, when functioning properly, directs all other faculties according to reason and values rather than in reaction to external pressure. When the hegemonikon is strong, when your sense of self is genuinely, solidly, unperformatively grounded, the identity offer simply doesn't land. Because there is no vacancy for it. You already know who you are. And who you are is not determined by the social architecture of this particular room or this particular person's need to occupy the dominant position within it. A woman named Patience, and the name is almost too fitting, worked for years in an industry dominated by people who had decided, collectively and unconsciously, that she did not belong at the table where the important decisions were made. They never said this directly. They said it in 100 smaller ways. The meeting invitations that arrived after the key decisions had already been made. The credit that migrated toward other people's names. The questions directed over her head to colleagues who happened to look more like the image of authority the room had agreed on. Patience spent 2 years trying to earn the seat. Performing competence. Over-delivering. Making herself undeniable. Then she understood something that changed her entire strategy. She already had the seat. She had earned it through every qualification, every result, every contribution she had made. The only thing she hadn't done was decide, fully, finally, without caveat, that the seat was hers regardless of whether the room agreed. The moment she made that decision internally, everything changed externally. Not because the room suddenly became fair. But because she stopped giving the room the authority to determine her position within it. Refuse the role. Every time it is offered. Not dramatically. Not with a speech. Just, quietly, completely, from the inside, refuse it. And watch how quickly the offer stops being made. 4 lessons in. And I want you to notice something. Not one of these lessons has required you to become louder, more aggressive, more combative, or more like the person trying to intimidate you. Not one of them has asked you to fight the fire with fire. Because the Stoics understood something about power that most modern thinking has forgotten. Real power, the kind that cannot be manufactured or performed or stripped away by someone else's tactics, does not come from dominating the room. It comes from owning yourself within it. We have learned that intimidation is a performance that requires your participation. We have learned to control only the territory that genuinely belongs to us. We have learned that stillness is a more powerful language than noise. And we have learned to refuse the identity that intimidation attempts to install. Let me ask you something before we continue. Think about the most unintimidatable person you have ever encountered in your life. Not the loudest. Not the most aggressive. Not the one who fought the hardest or argued the longest or made the most noise in the room. The most unintimidatable. The one who walked into difficult spaces and somehow, without theatrics, without performance, without visible effort, remained completely, frustratingly, magnificently themselves. Undisturbed. Undiminished. Unshaken. What was it about them? I will tell you what it was. It was not a personality trait they were born with. It was not luck or confidence that arrived fully formed one morning without effort. It was a set of deeply internalized understandings about themselves and about the nature of power that had been built, practiced, tested, refined, until they became not something the person did but something the person was. That is what the next 3 lessons build. Not a technique you apply in the moment. An identity you inhabit permanently. Let's finish this. Lesson 5, use their aggression as information, not instruction. Here is a reframe that will change the way you experience intimidation permanently. When someone comes at you with aggression, with dominance, with the full force of their intimidation toolkit deployed specifically in your direction, your nervous system interprets this as a threat. And your nervous system is not wrong to do so. Human beings are wired, at the most primal neurological level, to experience social aggression as danger. The brain does not distinguish cleanly between physical threat and social threat. The alarm system sounds either way. But here is what your nervous system cannot tell you, and what your mind, once trained, absolutely can. Aggression is data. Not instruction. Not authority. Not evidence of their superiority or your inadequacy. Data. And data, unlike instruction, does not require obedience. It requires interpretation. When someone is aggressive toward you, the information embedded in that aggression is almost always one of 3 things. They feel threatened by something you represent. They have learned through years of conditioning that aggression produces compliance and are simply running a program that has historically worked. Or they are operating from a place of such profound internal insecurity that dominance is the only relational mode available to them. None of these things are about you. All of them are about them. There was an executive named Bernard who had built a reputation in his industry as someone you did not cross. He was sharp, successful, and deployed intimidation with the precision of someone who had spent decades refining the instrument. New people in the room felt it immediately. The temperature changed when Bernard disagreed with you. The air became thinner. A young analyst named Kwame joined the company and encountered Bernard in his first major presentation. Bernard interrupted him 3 times in 6 minutes, not with questions, but with the particular brand of interjection designed not to seek information but to establish hierarchy. To remind everyone in the room, including Kwame, of the order of things. Most people in Kwame's position would have folded. Apologized. Rushed through the rest of the presentation with the anxious energy of someone trying to get out of a room that has become hostile. Kwame did something different. He paused. Genuinely, unhurriedly paused. And in that pause, invisible to everyone watching but absolutely real to Kwame, he asked himself a question he had trained himself to ask in exactly these moments. What is this behavior telling me about him? And the answer arrived clearly. Bernard interrupted people who he perceived as potential threats to his authority. Which meant that Kwame's presentation had registered, on some level, as significant enough to require management. That was not a threat. That was a compliment wearing aggressive clothing. Kwame continued his presentation with a steadiness that the room noticed. He addressed Bernard's interruptions with respect and without defensiveness. He did not perform confidence. He simply continued being competent, because he had correctly identified that the aggression was information about Bernard's insecurity, not instruction about Kwame's worth. After the meeting, 3 senior colleagues sought Kwame out. Not because he had won a confrontation. But because he had demonstrated something rare and unmistakable in that room, he could not be rattled. And people, instinctively, powerfully, universally, are drawn to people who cannot be rattled. Because in a world full of noise and volatility, someone who remains clear is someone who can be trusted. Read the aggression. Extract the information. And then, having understood what it is actually telling you, decide, from a place of complete clarity, what you choose to do next. Not what the aggression is instructing you to do. What you choose. That distinction is everything. Lesson 6. Build the kind of self-knowledge that cannot be weaponized against you. Intimidation needs a target. And the most reliable targets are the ones we carry inside ourselves, the insecurities, the doubts, the unexamined wounds, the places where our self-knowledge has gaps that other people's opinions rush in to fill. The person trying to intimidate you is, whether consciously or not, a reconnaissance mission. They are looking for the places where you are uncertain about yourself. The places where your sense of worth is still contingent on external validation. The places where a well-aimed comment or a dismissive look or a carefully constructed atmosphere of inadequacy can find the crack it needs to get inside. And here is the brutal, clarifying truth. If they find those places, it is not because they are skilled. It is because you have not yet found them yourself. Seneca wrote to his friend Lucilius with the kind of honesty that only a genuine teacher offers. One of the most important things is this, to know yourself first, then to set yourself right. Self-knowledge, real, honest, unflinching self-knowledge, is the most impenetrable armor available to a human being. Not because it makes you perfect or invulnerable or beyond the reach of all pain. But because when you know yourself clearly, when you have examined your strengths and your limitations and your values and your wounds with honest, compassionate, unflinching eyes, there is nothing an intimidator can show you about yourself that you haven't already seen. And what you have already seen cannot shock you. What you have already named cannot be used as a weapon against you. What you have already owned cannot be weaponized by someone else. Think about it this way. If someone tries to intimidate you by implying you are not intelligent, and you carry, somewhere inside you, an unexamined terror that this might be true, the implication lands like a blade in an unprotected place. It finds the wound. It goes deep. But if you have spent genuine, honest time with your own mind, if you know precisely what you are capable of and precisely where your limitations lie, and you have made peace with the full, honest picture, then the implication arrives and finds nothing to grip. Because you have already been there. You have already looked at the thing they are trying to use against you and made your own assessment of it. Your assessment, arrived at honestly, held without defensiveness, supersedes theirs. Always. A woman named Renee had spent most of her professional life being the youngest person in every room she entered. And for years, certain people in those rooms had used this as an intimidation tool, emphasizing her inexperience in moments designed to diminish her contributions, framing her ideas as the well-meaning but ultimately naive output of someone who hadn't yet been shaped by enough failure. For years it worked. Because Renee carried, privately, a genuine uncertainty about whether they were right. Then Renee did something that changed everything. She spent 3 months in what she described as an honest audit of herself. Not a celebration of her strengths. Not a spiral into her insecurities. An actual, balanced, evidence-based inventory, what she knew, what she didn't know, what she had achieved, where she had fallen short, what her instincts were reliable about, and where she needed more experience. At the end of those 3 months, Renee had something more valuable than confidence. She had clarity. And the next time someone attempted to use her youth as a lever, she felt something she had never felt before in that situation. Nothing. Not because the comment didn't register. But because she had already been to that place. She had already looked at the question of her experience with honest eyes and arrived at her own answer. Their version of the story had nowhere to land because her version was already fully, solidly in place. Know yourself before they try to define you. Because the person who has done that work, honestly, completely, without vanity or self-deception, is the person who simply cannot be intimidated through the manipulation of their self-perception. They have already been there. And they have already decided what is true. Lesson 7. Choose your response as if history is watching. This is the final lesson. And it is the one that elevates everything else from strategy to character. The Stoics were not simply interested in winning interactions. They were not building a toolkit for outsmarting people in the moment and moving on. They were building something far more ambitious and far more lasting. They were building a character, a consistent, integrated, values-driven way of being in the world that did not change based on who was in the room or what pressure was being applied or how high the social stakes were. Marcus Aurelius returned obsessively to a single question in his private journals. Not how do I win this? Not how do I make them regret this? But, how does the good person respond here? The good person. Not the clever person. Not the victorious person. The good person. And I want to bring that question into the context of intimidation, because it produces something that no other frame quite produces. When you ask yourself, in the middle of a difficult interaction with someone who is trying to make you small, how does the good person respond here? Something shifts. The question lifts you out of the reactive, ego-driven, emotionally triggered space where intimidation does its best work. And it places you somewhere else entirely. It places you in the perspective of the person you are trying to become. And the person you are trying to become does not stoop. Does not retaliate out of wounded pride. Does not perform strength for the benefit of an audience. Does not make decisions in the heat of intimidation that the cooler, clearer, more considered version of themselves would be ashamed of later. The person you are trying to become responds from values. Always. Even when, especially when, the situation makes that difficult. Let me tell you about a man named Solomon. Not a king. A teacher. A high school teacher in a difficult school in a difficult neighborhood who had a parent come into a parent-teacher conference one afternoon with the full force of everything that word, intimidation, implies. The parent was loud. He was dismissive. He questioned Solomon's competence, his commitment, his right to speak about his child. He used the particular brand of aggression designed to make the other person either fight back or fold. Solomon did neither. He waited for the parent to finish. And then he said something quietly and without any trace of defensiveness. I can hear how much you love your son. And I want exactly what you want for him. Can we start there? The room changed. Not because Solomon was weak. Not because he was a pushover. But because he had asked himself, in the 2 seconds between the end of the parent's aggression and his own response, the question Marcus Aurelius would have recognized immediately. How does the good person respond here? And the good person, Solomon understood, does not meet fire with fire when water will serve better. The parent left that meeting as an ally. Not because Solomon had won. But because Solomon had refused to make winning the point. This is what responding as if history is watching looks like in practice. It is not grand. It is not dramatic. It does not require a speech or a moment of cinematic triumph. It is just, the quiet, consistent, values-driven choice to be the person you actually want to be, regardless of the pressure being applied to be something lesser. And here is what that choice produces over time, and this is the part one want you to carry with you long after this video ends. A reputation that cannot be constructed by someone else's narrative. Because when you respond consistently from character, when the people around you accumulate enough interactions with you to see the pattern, they develop a picture of you that no intimidator can overwrite. Not because you are perfect. But because you are consistent. And consistency, in a world of reactive, ego-driven, pressure-sensitive behavior, is one of the rarest and most powerful things a human being can demonstrate. You become the person in the room whose response, under pressure, everyone already knows. Not because you are predictable in the way of someone limited. But because you are reliable in the way of someone with an actual foundation. That is the final weapon in this arsenal. And it is the one that never runs out. The integration, all 7 lessons as one. Let me bring all 7 together. Not as a list, but as a portrait of the person these lessons are building. This person understands that intimidation is a performance that requires their participation, and they have stopped participating. They have drawn the boundary of their sovereignty at the edge of their own inner world, and they defend that territory with the quiet ferocity of someone who knows exactly what is at stake. They are still in the room. They are present, attentive, fully engaged. But they are rooted in themselves in a way that the turbulence around them simply cannot reach. When aggression comes, and it will come, they read it as information. They extract what it is telling them about the person deploying it. And they respond not to the aggression itself but to the actual reality beneath it, which is almost always far less threatening than the performance suggests. They have done the work of knowing themselves, honestly, completely, without vanity, so that there is no gap in their self-knowledge for someone else's definition to fill. They have been to the places where they are uncertain, and they have made their own assessments. Which means the assessments of intimidators arrive to find the territory already occupied. And in every interaction, especially the difficult ones, especially the ones where the pressure is high and the stakes feel enormous and the easiest thing in the world would be to either fold or retaliate, they ask themselves the question that Marcus Aurelius asked himself in his private journals by lamplight 2,000 years ago. How does the good person respond here? And then they respond that way. Not perfectly. Not without difficulty. Not without the very human experience of feeling the pressure and choosing the higher response anyway. But consistently. Reliably. From the inside out. That is the portrait. And it is available to every single person watching this. Not as a destination to arrive at perfectly. But as a direction to move in, daily, deliberately, one interaction at a time. Starting with the very next person who tries to make you feel small. Final word. Somewhere in your life right now, there is a person, or a situation, or a dynamic that has been testing you. Pressing on the places where you are uncertain. Attempting to establish an authority over your sense of self that was never theirs to claim. You know who it is. Or what it is. And I want you to leave this conversation with something more than information. I want you to leave with a decision. The decision that your inner world, your clarity, your values, your self-knowledge, your sovereign assessment of your own worth, is not available for public revision. Not by their aggression. Not by their dismissiveness. Not by the rooms they construct or the silences they weaponize or the looks they deploy with the precision of someone who has been practicing intimidation for years. None of it reaches the center. Because the center, your center, belongs to you. It has always belonged to you. And from this moment forward, you are going to live like you know that. Quietly. Completely. Without needing anyone's permission or acknowledgement or understanding. You are going to walk into the difficult rooms, the ones with the difficult people and the carefully constructed atmospheres designed to remind you of your place, and you are going to be, simply and fully and without performance, yourself. Unintimidated. Not because nothing touches you. But because what touches you no longer moves you off your foundation. That is the Stoic way. That is the only power worth having. The places where ancient philosophy meets the actual texture of your actual life, and produces something that you can carry into every room, every relationship, every moment where who you are is being tested. If that is what you came here for, and I believe it is, then subscribe to the Stoic Path right now. Hit that button. Turn on your notifications. Because this conversation is one of many, and what is coming next belongs in your life.